To Danny. Yes, didn't it happen to Ronald Reagan and Henry McLeish once? I remember when he called people. Did he call people bastards as well? I can't remember. It's obviously very common. But so welcome everyone. My name's Jerry Hassan, and tonight we're going to have a kind of presentation, slides, and exploration of inequality and the independent debate from Professor Danny Dorling. Now, Danny doesn't really need any introduction, but for those of you who don't know the full range of his work, he is the Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at Oxford University and previously at Sheffield University. And he's author of, just published this year, a book on one of the kind of key issues of kind of division and issues that the political class don't address, the housing crisis. In the book All That Is Solid, how the great housing disaster defined our times. And before that, you may know books like Injustice, Why Social Inequality Matters, which is a really, to my mind, a book that really supplements works like The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett, but it actually has a much deeper grasp about the issue of politics, ideology and choice. And also because he is so prolific, coming out just after our vote, sadly, on September the 25th, is Inequality and the 1%. Now, Danny's actually, not intervened, that's the wrong phrase, but contributed to the Scottish debate in many ways from that writing, and also he was involved in a book that I was involved in called After Independence last year, where he wrote about if Scottish independence is just about independence and staying where we are, it's really not worth the paper it's written on. And interestingly, we were just having a chat about the issue of The Guardian, which has written some really dire stuff on our debate, and Danny was the subject of a Guardian editorial praising him a couple of years ago. He informed me was just after the paper, this is 2010, just after the paper came out, made that really wise choice of coming out for the Lib Dems in the 2010 election. And it said about him that he is that rare thing. He's an expert, he's politically engaged, and he's able to explain simply why the subject, i.e. inequality, matters to us all. So without further ado, I give you Danny Dorling. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm an academic, I'm a geographer, so I'm going to show you some maps. I've been interested in the independence debate from the point of view of England, of what might happen to England, what could happen to England. And I've been increasingly, that's a very English word, disappointed. That's the word people on the right use when they're very, very, very angry. I've been disappointed about the lack of a debate or much commentary within England about what's going on. What you tend to get are journalists based in London who are Scottish, who are interested in it writing. And the same for academics. And then finally, there's an academic who wrote a piece, which I didn't agree with, but I sent him an email congratulating them, and he bothered, and saying it's great to see somebody who isn't Scottish getting involved in this. And he had sent me an email back saying, actually, even though his surname wasn't obviously Scottish, he was. And I think it shows what the mood in England and amongst the English establishment is, which is, you're not going to vote yes. And even if you did vote yes, it wouldn't matter very much for England. And that is the impression I get. I suspect if you did vote yes, it could have a very big effect on England. These things are completely unpredictable, what the effect would be, but there are ways, if you're a romantic, of imagining it could have a good effect on England. And I'll get towards that in the end. So maps, we draw stretch maps, so this is what the United Kingdom looks like in terms of people, and those are the votes that matter in Scotland and where they are. Here we are in Europe. Again, we stretch Europe so you can see those lovely Scandinavian nations are all very lovely, but they're relatively small. If you're looking at the population of Europe, that makes you concentrate on the places that matter. We have no control over how these maps come out. They just take the population and plug it into a computer program and it stretches it to produce what you get. This sometimes has unfortunate results. My colleague Dr. Hennig here last night won an award at the Cartography Society for this particular map. And here we have another country, Japan. Japan is rather like the Scandinavian countries in terms of the degree of solidarity and equality that goes on in Japan, but 130 million people. And we never talk about Japan. We never put Tokyo up as a kind of city that we should look at for a city that works, where the transport works, where there is very, very little crime. According to the Foreign Office, the most likely bad thing to happen to you in Japan if you're a tourist is that you lose your passport by yourself. That's the highest number of recorded incidents. We tend to look to the United States as a guide, which is not good if you're interested in inequality, and we don't tend to look to mainland Europe. I didn't draw this particular diagram, but I think it really sums up how the UK is run, where the money is, what matters in terms of how the elite and the establishment think. Each circle there is a city. If you look very carefully, you'll see Glasgow and Edinburgh there, and each circle is sized by the value of residential dwellings in that city. It's now, it says a year old, it's actually almost 2 years old, and you have to add 200 billion to that middle circle because of the boom that's currently going on in London and the South East in prices. This is an incredibly unequal set of nations. Here's another way of looking at the housing boom. We've just taken all the London boroughs and made them the size of the increase in property value. And you'll see that London as a whole has had a bigger increase in value than the whole of the North East, the North West, and you'll see the other side put together. No Wales or Scotland in this data. There's something going on which is quite extreme, which is of course being talked down and saying, oh, don't worry, it'll calm down, it'll slow down. But what you're getting, as I'll show you a bit later, at the moment in the southeast of England, is people desperately trying to buy a house, a very small house, if they can, and the number of people who can buy houses, of course, is going down and down and down, because they think that if they can't buy a house now, they will for the rest of their lives be a tenant, which in most cases means a private tenant, because we now have more people renting privately than renting off councils or housing associations. And we're heading back towards that period before the Second World War, when the majority of the population is renting and the landlords control what they can do. These figures were produced by the estate agent Savills. We live in very strange times. Savills actually are getting slightly concerned about the extremes of inequality and how they're rising, and they were reported in the Financial Times. Landlords have made an absolute killing in the last 10 years, and particularly since the crash, because people at first were not able to buy when there was a crash, so they rented. Then when property prices rise, the value of landlord's property rises. They use all the rents to buy more houses, so if you're trying to get a home in the southeast of England, you're competing with landlords. Here's the same thing shown another way. As you see, I'm going to focus about England, because I am simply not qualified to talk about the debate in Scotland, but I'm interested about what's wrong with England, and what if there was a yes vote, would that have an effect on England? What would it be? Right? Would it just be shrugged off, or would there be some soul searching to be done? You know, how can one part of a larger union decide that it doesn't really want the supposed trickle down from the wealth creators and so on? It wants to be out of this. And there's many more implications. For one thing, if you begin, well, almost a day after a referendum, if there was a yes vote, people who trade in currencies will have to take another look at sterling. Because if sterling is only backed up by the assets south of the border, you have to remember, all these assets, 60% of our total wealth, is just our residential property. And it's not that this residential property is that much different to what it was 50 years ago. It isn't that these houses that cost £2 or £3 million are actually £2 or £3 million objects. It's fictional. So if you take the oil out, how safe do the finances of England look? How safe does the whole thing look? If you had to defend sterling, you have to raise interest rates. What happens if you raise interest rates by 0.5% or by 1%? I'll get onto that a bit later. But I just want to give you more of an image of what I think is wrong. This is a very old cartoon that was produced in the Plebs Journal. If you simply add 2 noughts, you can turn it into a modern day cartoon. You'd probably make at least one of the figures female. And if you have any suggestions for what you do for the hats that could update it, I'd be grateful. But we do have people sinking at the bottom. We have the soup kitchens coming back in since 2008 in very large numbers. To give you the summary of how it's really worked, most people have stepped down. The Institute of Fiscal Studies shows that there's been an increase in equality of income since 2008 that has got us back to 1991 levels for the UK as a whole, as long as you miss out the top 1%. As long as you miss out the top 1%, the top 1% have carried on soaring upwards. And you've got to ask yourself, what would it take to stop that? What would it take to stop rising inequality? And I'll keep on saying in England. The last time inequality fell was around about 1913, 14, 15, 16, 17. That was the kind of turning point. Ireland leaving certainly didn't make the rest of the United Kingdom a less radical place. We had decade after decade of rising equality from that period through to the end of the 1970s. And half of the increase in equality we got between incomes occurred before 1939. But now we're going in the opposite direction. To be in the top 1%, if you haven't got any kids, and there's 2 of you, it's £160,000 a year. If you tell people in London this, they say, what, so low? Household income as low as 160? Because people, affluent people in London, are used to higher incomes because, of course, in London, far more than 1% of the population are in the 1% because the 1% are so crowded there. These graphs are showing the proportion of income that the top 1% have taken historically in a series of countries. I didn't pick these countries. All countries were pretty unequal around the time of the First World War. In all of them, equality increased. Around the time of the First World War, the best off 1% were taking a quarter of all income. So that's the time of stately homes and servants and so on. By the time you get down to the 1980s and 1970s, at least in the UK, the top 1% was taking about 6% of all income. Now the top 1% in the UK has got back up to around about 15% or 10% after tax. But if you look at the Netherlands, you'll see you can have a very different story. There's a new figure which isn't shown there for 2012, I think, which says the Netherlands, the top 1% is taking about 6 or 7% of all income. I think the top 1% really matter. It's not just, it's a very simple statistic. It's that the cleavage in British society has now opened up between the 1% and the 99%, because the rest of the top 10% have actually seen their incomes fall. Partly because, of course, the rest of the top 10%, they're not affected by that tax cut. They were never paying the top rate of tax. They've had their child allowance taken off them and so on. If you're in the 1%, you don't often bother to collect child benefit because it doesn't make much difference to your income. Here's a little graphic just showing you wealth distribution, a way of looking at the unequalness of wealth in the country. We are one of the most unequal countries in the world. Wealth is very hard to measure, as Thomas Piketty has found out recently, but this just gives you an idea about how unequal we are. But you can become more unequal than this. And the more unequal than this is the United States. This isn't my graphic, it was produced by a professor in New York. And the date for the graphic is 2007. And the reason the date's 2007 is that by 2010, that 40% actually had negative wealth. They were in the Atlantic. And that really gets politicians scared, because if you've got 40% of your population with absolutely nothing to lose, you can have serious problems. If you included their residential wealth in that, it got even worse, because the bottom 40% had negative equity. It's now gone back up to that kind of picture. Britain is one of the favoured places for the super rich in the world to live. The favoured places are the United States, London and Singapore, the places where people with lots of money feel safe to be. And this is a graph from the United States showing that there's a very nice correlation between how much those at the top take, how big their share is, and how much deregulation you get, how much they manage to get laws changed to help them maintain and keep that share. The most extreme statistics on this are the top bankers' pay statistics. We have something like 2,200 bankers who are paid over €1 million a year. The next highest number is in Germany, where it's 197. If you take all the top paid bankers of the rest of Europe together, they don't get up to our level. Or in Owen Jones's new book, my favourite little stat from that, if you compare Japan to Barclays Bank pays more people over £1 million a year than are paid in the whole of Japan. In Japanese society, they have the highest life expectancy in the world. Things work. We are incredibly extreme. Why are our bankers so highly paid? Because they're used to US norms. They fly back and forth from New York to London. Another graph about wealth inequality. The Office of National Statistics accidentally released this data and then rescinded it and said it's unreliable because they don't know the wealth of the top 1%. That's probably a conservative estimate, to be honest, if you look at the super rich list. And just a few more graphs and then I'll get back to a bit of politics. This is showing the proportion of households in England who are now renting with children, households with children who are now renting privately. And you'll see this incredible rise since 2008. So a quarter of households, so it's a quarter of families who've got kids in England are now renting from a private landlord. It's just suddenly happened. And the reason it suddenly happened is that these families don't have as much money as couples without children. So they can be outbid by the childless, if you like. And the tragedy you're beginning to get in the southeast of England is families being moved on and on and on again because the landlord can get somebody who can pay slightly higher rent. So kids are having to swap school again and again and again and they're losing their friends again and again. And this is very sudden. The big rise is very sudden. I don't think it was planned. We can debate about that. What's amazing is the acquiescence to this in England. Almost absolute acquiescence. I'm renting privately because I didn't try hard enough and I didn't get a good enough job that would let me not do that. No realisation that your chances of being able to be a bit steadier have gone down. No memory, really, no memory left that we had rent controls and rent regulations all the way from the First World War through to the 1980s. There's an acquiescence in the southeast of England. And this is the kind of thing that concerns me, which I think is very different from, well, I know it's very different from what you get up here. Example is housing rights. The law's been changed here to mean that people intervening in renting your house cannot rip you off and charge you various things. The Labour Party in England will not even consider suggesting implementing the laws that have been put in Scotland to protect private tenants because they don't want to interfere with the market. That's the kind of statement. If people tell you this is inevitable and you're told in England and in London this is inevitable, it's a global race, we're all becoming more unequal, you just got to live with it, and if you're lucky you can get the trickle down from the rich, you need to look at these amazing socialist countries of the Netherlands and Switzerland just to see how you can control the 1%. The 1% will always have the most, by definition, and they will always be small, by definition. But there's no need for them to take 15% of income. It can gradually go down. There's the housing one. Oh, Just got a map in of a relatively small country that seems to operate quite well. And there's 1% getting poorer in those two countries. And a little map of Switzerland for you. Top tax rates progressively come down in more unequal countries. And as the country becomes more unequal, the top tax rates come down, and the tax on people at the bottom rises, and you increase VAT, you increase a whole series of things that are crazy taxes. Like the cost of fuel. You have to pay for fuel. And that's in effect as a flat tax. I'll just leave that there, but won't explain it. It's a complicated one. But it's just about how dire the situation is in the United States for pensioners. I think it's very interesting, if you take this debate and the polls in Scotland, that the one group who is solidly no are the over 60s, because they think that by voting no, your pension will be safe and your savings will be safe. And you have to look, if the UK carries on in its trajectory towards becoming like the USA, that's how safe your pensions are. Only a tiny number of pensioners end up okay. Fewer and fewer people have private pensions. The collective pensions arrangements that they are being undermined. I'm in a university pension scheme. That is progressively being changed over what I might eventually get, if I get it at all, because of course the money's gambled on the stock markets. We occasionally have brave statements made by people like the Children's Commissioner, who I think lost their job shortly after making this statement, but about who is being hit the hardest. But it's a minority thing really in England, talking about who's being hit the hardest. And we get these kind of graphs, complicated graphs produced by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, but they're kind of glossed over in the debate. The only reason, by the way, that the richest there get richer is that 1% within them. The other 9/10 haven't. But the 1% have got so much better off that it drags the average up for the top 10%. People don't like inequality. This is a Mori poll taken around the world. Almost everywhere, apart from the United States, almost a majority are against a degree of inequality. There isn't an obvious pattern to the ranking of those countries. But just being against inequality doesn't get you away from inequality. Apologies, I think we're getting towards the end of the complicated graphs. This is one on housing, and I'll just explain this one because I do think it matters. That top line is comparing the number of rooms per person in the property that the best of tenth of people live in, compared to the worst of tenth at each census since 1911. So in 1911, the best of people had 4 times more rooms per person in their homes than the worst of tenth. We had real overcrowding in 1911. That hit a peak in 1921, and then, and this is what 60, 70 years of progressive efforts get you, and then we got down to the inequality being 3 times as many rooms. That was the achievement. The achievements of greater equality are often pretty small. Another good example might be what the Labour government did over education. Labour government did do some things about education that made it more equal in the south. It had the effect of increasing the proportion of children from the poorest of homes who got to go to university. That effect was 1 extra child in a classroom of 30 got to go to university. And that was hated by people who don't think those children should have gone. And at the end, after the 1980s, you suddenly see this. It's an incredible rise in inequality of households per room. Part of it is ageing. Part of it is a good news story. Our housing stock was designed for us to die in our 70s, and then we very efficiently give it to another family. If you live into your 80s and 90s and you don't move home, but it's not just that, this is rising wealth inequality from rising income inequality. This is my favourite graph, it's a Piketty graph. and it's showing you the change since 1960 in the top rate of tax in various countries. Switzerland, top rate of tax stays the same. Right? The rich still have to pay a high rate of income tax, but in the countries where the 1% have increased their take the most, that's the increase of the 1%, they've got the top rate of tax down by 40%. And it's a pretty good correlation. Top rate of tax matters. It's not about getting money, and this is often confused. You don't have a high top tax rate because you want to bring in a lot of money. What a rate of 60 or 70% does, say over earnings £200,000 a year, is it stops a young, greedy man, almost always a man, working for a bank, asking for a massive pay rise, because they won't get most of that money. People make a mistake of thinking that having high top tax rates is about raising money. It isn't. We have very low top tax rates, but a third of all our income tax comes from the 1% because they pay themselves so much. I like this quote because I've read it, just have to move back home to Oxford, about Oxford Run Britain. It's an example of I think a Scots based in London talking about what's going on. The insularity of England, the way in which people have gone to only 1 or 2 universities, done the same course, PPE has got a lot to answer for. It's a very, very small, tight-knitted group with a kind of similar mindset about what people are told and what they think is possible. I thought I should put in an example. I'm not being that flippant because I did think for a bit, but an example of one thing that England does better than Scotland. So I've got this for you. This is a proper 20-mile-an-hour zone. Okay, so I'm not being... This is a 20-mile-an-hour zone that means you're not allowed to drive more than 20 where there are children playing in the streets. This is a bad 20-mile-an-hour zone because it's advisory. Right? There's probably more than that I can give you. It's not all one way, but as the South has become more dog-eat-dog and so on, it is hard to find things where you'd say, couldn't you learn from this, swap ideas, it's good. I'm a Southerner, I grew up in the South, I've gone back to the South, I kind of like the South, but the South I see is a nastier and nastier South of England, and very different of course from the North of England. I lived 10 years in Newcastle, 10 years in Sheffield. You get very different attitudes still there. So to wrap up, I think we need to worry about extreme rates of inequality in the top 1%, the 0.1%, the 0.01%. I'm not the only person who thinks this. President Obama had it last year as one of his 2 major agenda items. The President of China had it as one of his 2 major agenda items. The Pope had it in his Easter address. The businessmen who meet in Davos came up with 30 problems, major problems the world was facing. And the top 3 were climate change, income inequality, and unemployment. So even they had it in. When you look at those numbers from Oxfam, which Forbes magazine said had got out of date almost as fast as Oxfam published them, we're seeing something that is out of control and which London is actively courting to bring in these people to supposedly get the trickle down or the wealth from them or the jobs from them. You need something to protect yourself from this. Otherwise, you are likely to end up being badly and insecurely housed. You are likely to pay a very high proportion of your wage or salary to rent. Almost all of it will go to make somebody else richer because they're not spending the rent building a house for you or doing it up. The quality of property is appallingly bad that's being rented. And if you want to get even scarier about what's happening, if it carries on going in this direction and you have a couple of children, one of your children could become a servant for somebody who's very rich. Because one of the major ways in which the job opportunities rise, particularly in London, when you get a concentration of people with such high amounts of money, is that they need cleaners, they need people to look after their kids, they need gardeners,